Hello. Oh, that worked well. I'd like to welcome you all to Carnegie and for our panel discussion today on the elections in Iraqi Kurdistan and the implications of those. My name's Aliza Marcus. I'll be moderating this panel. I write on Turkey and the Kurds, and for those of you who haven't bought my book yet on the PKK, it recently came out in paperback and also in Turkish. It's called Blood and Belief, published by NYU Press, so you now have no excuse. I don't really need to say anything on the Iraqi Kurdish elections because we have the experts here right now. Let me introduce them afterwards. We'll move on to question and answer period. So let's move forward. Our first speaker will be Joost Hilterman. Is our first? Oh, I'm sorry. No. Henri Barkey will be our first speaker, who's here at Carnegie, and you all have his bio. He's a well-known expert on not just Turkey and the Kurds, but the region in general. He will be followed by Kubad Talabani, who is the representative of the Kurdistan Regional Government here in Washington, and he was in Kurdistan for the elections. And finally, Joost Hilterman of the International Crisis Group, which recently came out with a report on Kirkuk, and that report is available outside. So, Henri.
Thank you, Aliza. Well, by now, everybody knows that the elections in northern Iraq produced a rather surprising result, and the party called Goran, or Change, managed to get almost 25% of the vote, and to the great surprise of many, did exceedingly well in an area of the world where two traditional parties, the Kurdistan Democratic Party and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, the two dominant parties since 1991, had almost a complete lock on politics. Golan, or the Change Party, so to say, essentially tapped into a great deal of discontent in the Kurdish regions, especially among the youth, with the absolute control that the two major parties had in northern Iraq. And it is true that the two parties which controlled the area since 1991 provided essentially a combined list for these elections where, by virtue of their dominant position, had become stultified to some extent. There was a great deal of corruption, cronyism, nepotism, all the things that come with absolute power. And to some extent, the Golan Party tapped into that demand for change. The truth is that the signs of unrest or the signs of discontent have been around in northern Iraq for a while. In 2006, you may remember, there was demonstrations in Halabja at a time when a memorial to the victims of the Saddam Hussein's gas attack in Halabja was to be unveiled, and it was really quite surprising. In universities in northern Iraq, students were upset at the fact that they were being forced to essentially choose between one of the two parties, if they wanted to study, if they wanted to get funds from the state. So in a sense, for what is interesting, of course, is that it showed that even when you have two very, very dominant parties, it is quite possible for a third movement to emerge and emerge well. What is ironic about these elections is that most of the votes for the Change Party came from the PUK areas. In fact, the leader of the Change Party, Najran Mustafa, is a former member of the PUK. And so it is ironic in the sense that it came from most of these votes came from the PUK area, because if you were to compare the two regions or the two parties in northern Iraq, you find that the KDP in some ways is much more close. It's a much more close party. It is much more, I wouldn't say necessarily authoritarian, but much more control oriented. And the PUK is in that sense a little bit more liberal. And yet most of the change votes came from the PUK at the expense of the PUK. On the other hand, it is easy also to explain this because when you look at the composition of the two regions, the KDP regions and the PUK regions, you find that the KDP tends to be much more rural, much more traditional, whereas the PUK areas tend to be more middle class. The PUK itself is a much more middle class movement, and hence, you expect essentially discontent to arise in more in middle class areas. But I will talk about the implications, and you can divide the implications of these elections into three. One, with respect to domestic KRG politics. Two, the relationship between the Kurdistan Regional Government and Baghdad. And thirdly, I would include the relationship between the KRG and Ankara, and you will see why I include Ankara here, because of all the surrounding countries. In many ways, it's things are happening in Turkey which are very, very interesting, and I'll explain in a minute. In terms of the domestic KRG politics, on the negative side, the emergence of Goran and the fact that Goran took so many votes from the PUK essentially undoes the balance, the delicate balance that had been created between the two parties, the PUK and the KDP. So it is also quite possible that, given the fact that the PUK is now much weaker as a result of Goran's success, that the KDP may then say that it should not. The PUK should not get 50% of the cabinet positions, maybe resist essentially the PUK regional leader Barham Saleh from becoming prime minister. So there is an inherent tension at the moment in terms of the KDP and PUK balance, and it is also true that the two parties need to have a certain degree of cohesion in the next few months because of the number of issues that are going to come up in terms of Iraqi politics. There are elections in January, in national elections, so splitting the Kurdistan alliance in that sense would be detrimental. Most importantly, also, there are still very big issues to be discussed with Baghdad. The issue of Kirkuk, the boundaries, the issue of the boundaries, and finally the oil law. But I will also leave it to Kuba to tell us, since he probably knows exactly what's going to happen, we've discovered that he voted 5 times, but But also, I actually do believe that these elections are a blessing in disguise. They're a blessing in disguise because finally you have a serious opposition to the two parties. And the two parties definitely needed a comeuppance. One. Two, in an ironic way, the emergence of Goran is probably going to strengthen the hand of the reformers within the Kurdistan alliance, and specifically probably within the PUK. Now, if Barham Saleh, who's the current deputy prime minister in Baghdad, is to become the new prime minister of the KRG, Barham Saleh, who is, I'm sure, known to most of you, he's both a doer, a reformer, he's squeaky clean, so he has all the attributes of somebody who can bring change. And in many ways, his hand will be strengthened by Goran's success, and he'll be able to push for changes. I think most of the problem will be in the KDP regions, where there'll be much stronger resistance. In terms of relations with Baghdad, the potential for relations between Baghdad and the KRG going south very quickly is actually quite high. Despite Prime Minister Maliki's visit to see Barzani this week, and promises that they will work together, the fact is that because of the upcoming January elections and Maliki's attempt to kind of run in those elections as a nationalist Iraqi leader who will stand up to Kurdish demands, is likely to sour, I think, the relations between Erbil and Baghdad. And also there might be the temptation for Maliki in particular to kind of play on the differences between the KDP and the PUK, maybe see some daylight between the two organizations and make play on that. Finally, with respect to Turkey, and Turkey is about to, if press reports are correct, is about to engage in a major attempt at reforming its own relationship with its own domestic Kurdish population. I would argue that this would not have happened, or this would not have been on the table had it not been for the fact that the Turks have, in the last year, made an almost 180-degree change in their policy towards northern Iraq. And as a result of this, now they're in a much better position to start moving ahead with reform at home. But it is also critical that the help that the KRG will give to the Turkish government in this upcoming period is actually very critical, because if you know, as you know, the PKK, the Kurdish Turkish insurgent group, has half of its forces in northern Iraq, the other half in Turkey. So you will have to work out a demilitarization process and so on and so forth. I'm not going to get into all those details, but the KRG's presence, KRG's role is going to be very important. And in this context, and I'll finish on this, if Barham Saleh is to become prime minister in the north, he is someone who has always looked at the relationship with Turkey as a strategic relationship, that in his mind, the KRG has to have an excellent relationship with Ankara, because Ankara is the gateway to the West, the gateway not only as a NATO member and a EU candidate, but also because of trade routes and because of its Ankara's relationship with Washington. That's the most important relationship for the KRG. So you will find reasons why Barham Saleh is going to push much harder on better relations and a deal with Turkey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Henri. And now we'll move to Kubad.
Thank you. Thanks, Aliza. Thanks for having me here. It must be something inherently Washington-based for us to always try to find something negative, something worrisome, something that's about to go wrong or about to go south from every situation. I'm going to actually try to focus on something very positive that actually just happened in the Kurdistan region, and that is we've had fantastic elections that were largely free and fair by all of the international accounts that attended and monitored these elections, where we've had almost an 80% turnout of eligible voters that came and voted in these elections. Almost just under 2 million people, I think it was the actual numbers, where there was a fantastic and rigorous campaign process that went with these elections, where people were using very sophisticated mechanisms to campaign, and also some of the more traditional grassroots campaigning tactics. Having just returned, and just to clarify for the record, I only voted once, and I have some blue ink still left on my finger to prove that I actually voted, but I did only vote once, Henri. The excitement was running very high throughout the region. People saw it as a festival, as a carnival. Sometimes the excitement got a little too high. Sometimes it boiled over into some things that we didn't like to see. But all in all, the campaign process was very exciting. And as a Kurd, forget my party or government affiliations. As a Kurd, I was very, very proud of how the elections were conducted. I think the winners in the elections was the Kurdistan region, rather than a particular list, a particular slate. The region as a whole won these elections. There was a lot of scrutiny on us. There were a lot of people around the world, and some here in Washington, that had stated that democracy has regressed in Kurdistan, and there is a democracy deficit in Kurdistan, and that once a beacon of hope and stability is somewhat slipping into disarray. And I think these elections were a strong rebuff of those criticisms. The preliminary results are in. We're expecting the international, the Iraqi Independent High Electoral Commission of Iraq to announce and certify the results. It was supposed to be today. I'm not sure if I've missed it on my way coming here, but the results are supposed to be certified. The Kurdistani list, which is the slate made up of the PUK and KDP, will be given the opportunity to form the next cabinet of the Kurdistan region. As Henri rightfully said, that while the Kurdistani list did win a healthy majority in these elections, there is going to be a very healthy opposition in the system. Likely in the parliament. We're not sure if some of the opposition parties will choose to be part of the unity government that will be formed. But this vocal opposition within the parliament, I think, is not a blessing in disguise. It's actually it's a blessing in general, because once you have a viable opposition, it's going to hold the government more accountable. It's going to make the process more transparent, and I think, again, it's another very good step in the right direction for the Kurdistan region. There was a lot of international monitoring of the elections. Lots of organizations took part. Lots of domestic monitors were there as well. And we've received a lot of positive feedback from organizations such as the UN, the EU, the State Department, and other entities that were there following the elections. And I think that that's a positive sign as well, because it's not like '92 when we were somewhat in this strange part of the world holding elections with very little observation. There was a lot of international presence and good coverage from the international media and the US media as well. And while no doubt there will be some irregularities that have taken place in these elections, and there is some of the ballots are being recounted, and the independent commission right now is holding off on announcing the certified results because of some of these irregularities. But by all accounts, by all of the observer accounts, these did not exceed regular standards, regular international standards. And you know, we all remember Tallahassee of 2000 and what a debacle that created. So I think that we've got to be fair to the region. We've got to hold the region up to reasonable standards. And I think we surpassed the standards that we had set for ourselves as the Kurdistan region. These elections have made a lot of people interested about, well, what does this mean now that there's going to be a new government in Kurdistan, there's been a new parliament in Kurdistan, and a viable opposition within the Kurdistan region? What does this mean for Kurdistan-Baghdad relations? And being part of this very exciting campaign process, I can really attest to the fact that for the first time since we've been having elections in Kurdistan, these elections were about Kurdistan. They were not about Baghdad. They were not about Iraq. They were not about Article 140 or federalism, constitution, security matters. They were about services. They were about the effectiveness of the government. They were about the transparency of the financial process in the government. They were about sewage. They were about schools, education, healthcare, the nuts and bolts of politics. It was a perfect wake-up call to many in the current political elite that all politics, indeed, no matter where in the world, is in the end local. And people now need to be far more cognizant of the demands and of the needs of local Kurds. We cannot keep living on a revolutionary slogan of we liberated Kurdistan, we protected Kurdistan, we defended Kurdistan, so we're entitled to rule Kurdistan. That is not the case anymore. And I think this is a strong message that the people of Kurdistan have given the leadership of Kurdistan that they need better services, that they will be held accountable to better performance, to more transparent governance. And I think that is a not only a maturing of the society in Kurdistan, but I think it'll help mature the politics in Kurdistan and the politicians in Kurdistan. The reason why I say it will have little impact on, be it positive or negative, on the Baghdad-Erbil relations is because if you look at the core message of each of the four leading slates that took up the lion's share of the seats in these elections, is they all have pretty similar views on federalism in Iraq, on constitution, adherence to the constitution, on Article 140 and the resolution of Iraq's disputed internal boundaries, on equitable revenue sharing and the redistribution of Iraq's revenues in a fair, transparent and equitable way. You will not find much differences, much significant differences between the various different slates on these particular issues. And I feel that while there may be differences internally about how to do certain things, how to execute certain policies, when it comes to national politics, I'm expecting to see quite a united Kurdish bloc in the next parliament for Iraq and in the upcoming elections for Iraq in January. So I do want to take this opportunity to congratulate ourselves, the Kurdistan region, for fantastic elections. I want to take this opportunity to thank the observers and all of the friends that actually helped us with this process. It was a great step forward for Kurdistan. It was a positive step forward for Iraq. And I think that we should not lose sight of that this was an historic achievement for us that everybody was very excited about. And I'm pleased to come here and share my excitement with you, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have about it. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kuba. That was very interesting. And now we'll move on to Just, whose group does a lot of reports on Iraq and is working now on a report on governance in Iraqi Kurdistan. So it'll be very interesting to hear his views.
Thank you, Elisa. All right. I just go through some of the same issues, maybe with a slightly different take, and talking about the election results, what it means for the Kurdistan Parliament, for local elections, and then for the Iraqi elections and politics beyond that. First, I would just respond on the issue of the nature of the elections. It was, in fact, mostly violence-free, and that was a great thing. There was, on the day of the elections in Sulaymaniyah, apparently a move by the POK Peshmerga onto the roofs of the buildings and surrounding Naushirwan's Quran party headquarters. They were called off, apparently at the behest of the Americans who were inside Naushirwan's headquarters, and those Peshmerga were removed from the city center on the day of the elections after the results had started coming in. And there was some violence in Erbil in the days after the elections. In fact, one person was killed. There were some protests, and the Prime Minister, Massoud Barzani, went to calm things down, to apologize, and made all the right moves. He made them toward the Islamists rather than to Goran, which appeared to be the main victim of it, and probably in a bid to bring the Islamists over to the Kurdistani list, as all the parties are preparing to go into parliament. But generally, the elections went fairly well. There are allegations of fraud. Goran has contested a number of issues, and I think some 300 polling stations have yet not been confirmed. And these are in Duhok and Erbil. In Sulaymaniyah, by contrast, there were very few complaints. The opposition has reason to be happy there because it won, and has made no complaints. But in Erbil and Duhok it has, and we have to wait for the Electoral Commission to come out and declare something on those ballots. But I think by and large, I agree with Kobat that the elections went well. And that is a very good thing. And I think one of the main reasons is, I don't think that the inclination of the ruling parties in Kurdistan is much different from other ruling parties that have carte blanche, and they probably would have done more to stop and to use certain shenanigans to bring the results more favorable to their parties. But they are not Iran. In Iran, we've seen a much greater amount of fraud, but Iran is not dependent on the United States the way the Kurdistan Regional Government is dependent on the United States and Western states. So they were being watched very carefully, and the example I gave about the Peshmergas in Sulaymaniyah is a good example of that. That's also, I think, an important reason why things went fairly smoothly. One thing that hasn't been mentioned is the presidential elections. This was not only an election for the Kurdistan Parliament, it was also for the Kurdistan President, who was elected in a direct ballot. And the results are very interesting because Massoud Barzani, the current president, won close to 70% of the vote. but a relative unknown, Dr. Kamal Miraudali, received 25% of the vote. Now, most of the votes he got came from Suleimaniye. So that suggests that all the people who voted for Goran, what Goran got in the parliamentary elections, got just close to 24%. So most of those votes certainly would not have gone to Massoud Barzani. I can assure you that not a single Goran supporter would have voted for Massoud Barzani. So those votes would have gone to Kamal Miraudali for lack of a pro-Goran alternative, because he is not with Goran. But he picked up some other votes as well, maybe from Islamists, though the Islamists were instructed to vote for Massoud. Not maybe from the POK, but the POK was also instructed to vote for Massoud. And in fact, there's some anger on the part of Massoud Barzani, reportedly, in the direction of some people in the POK, including Vice President Khosrad Ali, for allegedly having instructed some people to vote for the opposition candidates and not for Massoud Barzani. And in fact, if people are saying that Kubat voted 5 times, the question is that if I were Massoud Barzani, I would say, well, you know, the more the merrier. But the more important thing is, who did you vote for?
People are not saying Kubat voted 5 times. This is a credible audience. I want to make sure that...
For the record, I'm convinced that Kubat voted only once. There are questions raised, not about Kubat, but by the KDP at the address of the POK about who they voted for as president. But I think that even if some voted for Miraudali as opposed to Massoud Barzani, there were very few, because largely if you look at the figures for the parliamentary elections and for the presidency elections, the Kurdistani list got 57%. If you add the Islamists to it, you have 70%. That is what Massoud Barzani got. So more or less, it makes sense. So I think there weren't that many POK defectors. And if there was anger, it's probably misdirected. I'll tell you in a second what the anger is mostly about in that case. Now, in terms of the parliament, it's very important to look at the figures. We don't have the final vote yet, so these are preliminary figures. But the Kurdistani list may walk away with 59 seats in the parliament. 59 seats because we're looking at a parliament of 111 seats, but of those, 100 are elected and 11 are quota seats set aside for minority groups. So let's look at 100 seats. 59 are for the KDP, 25 for Goran, 13 for the four parties list, also known as or what they call itself, the Reform and Services list, which are mostly the Islamists. And then 2 seats for a smaller Islamist group from Halabja and 1 vote for the Kurdistan Communist Party. So now this is interesting, because if the opposition manages to unite, then it could have 41 seats. This is speculation, obviously. But now Shuman Mustafa, the head of Goran list, has already met with the four parties list, with all the 4 leaders of that list, and they all agreed to go with Goran. But that's what they're saying today. Maybe tomorrow they say something else. But they may have 41 seats in parliament. That is interesting, because the Kurdistani list would have 59% plus probably the 11 minority seats. That's 70 seats. Clearly a majority, but not a 2/3 majority. But what it would allow the opposition to do is to boycott the first session of Parliament. Now, why would they do that? Well, they would do it just to make a big point. But secondly, they would do it because one of their the first demand is that all the people who used to be with the POK but indicated that they had shifted to Goran, who were working for the KRG and were laid off for the reason that they switched their loyalties, the demand is that they be reinstated and that their salaries be reinstated. This is a big issue for Goran because obviously some of their members are suffering now economically from the fact that they were laid off. And so this is what they're thinking of doing if they can muster the votes in the parliament and to have that kind of boycott. That's for the first session. The second real issue outcome is that we're going to have a real viable opposition, as Kubat said, a healthy opposition in Parliament, and that is going to have an impact on transparency and accountability. We may, for the first time, have actually a public budget in Kurdistan rather than a secret one. We may find out more about these oil contracts that are being signed by the Kurdistan Regional Government, which have not been public. And so we may see the first real steps toward fighting corruption. The Kurdistan Regional Government in the last few months has said many good things about fighting corruption, but concretely nothing has changed. the change list now intends to do it through its votes in parliament to force the Kurdistan Regional Government to be more transparent. We'll have to see whether that works. And the third main outcome already hinted at was the KDP-POK strategic agreement, which, by the way, is also secret, and that has lasted for many years, since 1991, essentially. It's been a 50-50 arrangement, which at times has worked very well, and at another time it led to civil war in the mid-1990s. And the question is, will the KDP want to continue this agreement when, in fact, the POK did not pull its weight? It clearly lost a lot of votes to Goran. It lost in Sulaymaniyah. It lost very humiliatingly to the Goranist in Koysenjak, the hometown of President Jalal Talabani. So does the POK deserve to have this 50%? But the problem is this was a closed list election, so all the seats have already been allocated 50-50 in the parliament. So in that sense, the POK will get the 50%. But then we talk about senior positions. Will the POK get the positions that it normally would have had if it had, in fact, pulled its weight? Will Barham Saleh, the question has already been raised, become the prime minister? It's not clear yet. The advantage is, the disadvantage is the KDP doesn't want the POK to get positions when it doesn't deserve it, and it cannot take it itself. It would like Massoud Barzani to be prime minister once again. It would like to control the government, as in fact it's already controlling it to a large extent. The weight of government has moved to Erbil away from Sulaymaniyah. But there is a disadvantage. If the KDP says to Barham, go back to Baghdad and continue your stint as deputy prime minister there, and apparently Barham cancelled his resignation as deputy prime minister, if he's sent back, you may find elements of the POK, not Barham, not some of the loyalists, but some of the fence-sitters, those who didn't switch to the Quran but are interested in moving to the Quran. You might push those out into an alliance with Quran in the parliament. And so that could be very negative for the KDP. And so they may have a stake in keeping the POK happy and on board and giving them the 50%. But in any case, the POK would then be a junior partner rather than an equal partner as we've had so far. Now, I mentioned very quickly earlier the local elections. We didn't have provincial elections in Kurdistan on January 31st of this year when there were provincial elections in the rest of Iraq, minus Kirkuk. We did not have them in Kurdistan region. They're supposed to take place still. There is no law for it yet that has been completed. But the question is what's going to happen and what will happen in Sulaymaniyah, what will happen in Erbil, which is going to be a real battleground. Less concerned about the Hook, where the KDP will certainly win. But we're waiting to see how well the Goran list will do in those local elections. And then there is municipal elections, which also should take place sometime later. Am I running out of time? I'll speak faster. Then we come to the Iraqi elections. I think this is a critical issue because in 2005, the Kurdistan list won 53 seats. And the Kurdistan Islamic Union, sort of the moderate Islamists, won 5 seats. So 58 seats for the Kurdistan Front, fairly united on all the key issues. Now, as has been mentioned before, now Shiwan and the Goran list, they have the same position on Kirkuk and on nationalist questions as the Kurdistani list. So not much will change. But Goran is already talking about running a separate list in the Iraqi elections. Now, that's important. What is also important is Maliki was just in the north. Some Arabs criticized him for going up, basically sort of conceding the point. I think it was a very clever move. He is taking advantage of divisions in the Kurdistan political scene. He's meeting with Massoud Barzani and Jalal Talabani on August 2nd. He went to Halabja on August 3rd. This is critically important. He went to Halabja and gave a speech about the need for justice on Halabja. This doesn't play well with the Sunni Arab audience, and I say that roughly because some Sunni Arabs would, of course, like it, others would not. But largely, those who were part of the former regime certainly would not like it. But he's talking to Kurds here, and he's trying to win Kurdish votes away in the Iraqi elections. He's trying to get maybe the Goran list to coalesce, to go in a coalition with him, because Maliki has already made clear that he wants a ethnic cross-sectarian alliance in the Iraqi elections in order to get rid of the Supreme Council and to get rid of the main Kurdish list as well. So that battle may be fought out still, and maybe the Kurdistani list will be clever and try to get in an alliance with Maliki instead. But we'll have to see. And then when that happens, there'll be a lot of bargaining over Kirkuk, because that's always the bottom line for the Kurds. So that's where we are. I would say that if in terms of the fracturing of the Kurdistan Front in the Iraqi parliament, what could happen is if we keep the same numbers of 58 Kurdish votes, because that may not change, all the Kurds will vote for Kurdish parties most likely, then if we use the same percentages as for the parliamentary elections in Kurdistan, the KDP-PUK may get 36 seats, and the opposition, meaning Goran and the Islamists, might get 22 seats. That's a real split. So the stakes are really high in that election. Sorry to take more time than I was.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to sum up and give some of my own perspectives on this and then open it up to questions. It was really interesting about, I think, what our panel said and about the elections in general was two issues. One, the issue of fraud and how Nashivan Mustafa did. I was in Iraqi Kurdistan before the elections, and I mean, everybody was saying they were sure there would be enormous amounts of fraud, and simultaneously they were sure that Nashivan Mustafa, the opposition candidate, would do terribly, not necessarily because of fraud, but because he had no support. And both of those turned out not to be really true. I mean, the fraud, as I think our panelists have pointed out, was limited. I mean, for whatever reasons, whether it was the U.S. or because the Kurds are working on their democracy or because it's difficult to do fraud, who knows? But it was definitely limited, and Nashivan Mustafa did surprisingly well. And while he really got most of his votes in the Suleymaniye area, I don't think it should be underestimated the extent to which he also won some support in Dohuk and Erbil. And this is sort of a more quiet challenge to Massoud Barzani and the KDP, but one they should definitely take notice of. These elections were interesting also because for the first time, with the successes of Nashivan Mustafa and the Goran list, for the first time you have a real development of an opposition Kurdish party if you look at Kurdish politics throughout the region. In Syria, Kurdish parties, when there's an opposition, they just split and split into nothingness. In Turkey, the PKK does not allow any other Kurdish political party to develop any real opposition. In Iran, we can't really talk about strong Iranian Kurdish politics at this moment. And for the Iraqi Kurds, they have, they have allowed, there has been the emergence of a strong opposition party, and I think this bodes well for Kurdish democratic politics in Iraqi Kurdistan. There are challenges, serious challenges. There's the domestic challenge of corruption, transparency, economic development. And I think the question is, to what extent will the KDP and PUK take on this challenge, or are they going to try to retrench and hold on to what they have? And this is something very important. There's also the question of Kirkuk, obviously. Will they continue on their current position? Will the position become even more nationalistic? Will Nashivan Mustafa take a softer position? When I saw him in Iraqi Kurdistan, he was saying, enough about this. We need to make a deal on Kirkuk. It doesn't necessarily need to be part of Iraqi Kurdistan. But then later on, I heard he was saying the exact opposite when it came to campaigning. Mm-hmm. So, we don't know exactly what's going to happen on Kirkuk. At the same time, as Henri pointed out, developments in Turkey will have an effect, or the Iraqi Kurds may be called on to play a role in the Turkish government's attempts to, what seems to be serious attempts to move forward on solving the Kurdish problem. With PKK rebels based in northern Iraq, with something like 11,000 Turkish Kurds in the Mahmur camp in northern Iraq, the question is, will the KRG be ready to do what Turkey is going to ask of it, and certainly with U.S. support, which is to help disarm the PKK if there is some sort of negotiated settlement, and to help move the people in the Mahmur camp back to Turkey or integrate them into Iraqi Kurdistan. So with that, I'd like to start off by asking our panelists some questions, since I get that right, and then move on to the audience. So if you don't mind, I'll ask the first questions. My first question is for Kubad. Kubad, at the time of after the elections, you were actually quoted as saying that your father, the president of Iraq and the head of the PUK, was concerned or surprised about the election results. Concerned about the election results. What's that concern going to translate into? I mean, is there a concrete plan for tackling the domestic issues that certainly led Nashivan Mustafa and the Goran list to do so well?
Well, thank you. I mean, first of all, it's perfectly normal for somebody to be concerned with the outcome of an election result. It's not something revolutionary that somebody who's running or his party's running in the elections, of course he's going to be concerned in the outcome. It doesn't mean he was alarmed or shocked at the results. But no doubt that this is an opportunity for the political parties to take a good look at themselves, find out where they have scored points with their constituencies, where they haven't scored points, and give themselves an opportunity to do a bit of inward reflection and do the necessary reforms within the party structures to move the process forwards and to move with the times. Unlike transitioning from a guerrilla movement to somewhat of a democratic system is not easy. It's a difficult one. We've had 17 years of trying to manage this transition. It was only 12 years ago that the internal fighting between the two parties ceased. It was only in 2003 that sanctions was ultimately lifted on Iraq. So it's been a very turbulent 17 years. But I think what we're still starting to see now is that we're able to look beyond the tragedies of our past and deal with the issues of today. And I think, again, going back to the issue of the politics being local is a really defining moment in Kurdish politics, that you have to look inwards, you have to worry about your own constituencies. And it's, it's some of the other panelists have spoken about, well, PUK is weaker and the KDP stronger and the little brother and the junior partner. We cannot define the strength of these two political parties as Suleymaniye is PUK's, Erbil is KDP's, Duhok's is KDP's. That if you look at the 2005 provincial election results there, you'll see that the PUK won a healthy percentage of the seats in the provincial council. So we should not try to look for the old fault lines within Kurdish politics. Kurdish politics has moved a considerable amount of distance in the right direction. To see the way that KDP and PUK officials were in a sense campaigning for each other and trying to get the votes out for the other side has I think really matured the partnership between the two parties. And there aren't people senior in either party that are looking at these election results and saying, well, how is this going to affect the strategic relationship between the two parties? I think that the strategic relationship between the two parties is going to remain quite strong. But I do expect also that both parties, and I can certainly speak for the PUK in this instance, will certainly do a bit of self-evaluation, look at how to modernize the party to be able to address today's challenges. This movement was a revolutionary movement. It was designed and created to overthrow a regime. We succeeded in that. The current structures were probably not designed to govern an area of 4 million plus people. And I think that's the realization that these elections have brought to us, is the fact that we need to readapt and reshift our focus from a revolutionary past to a modern movement that is designed to govern.
Okay, thank you very much. My next question is for Joost. Since I know you recently did a report on Kirkuk, and I'm interested in whether you see any link between making demands, let's say, or can we get the Kurds to make concessions from their perspective, concessions on Kirkuk, without demanding something similar from Arabs in Mosul, where there's been sort of the flip kind of conflict. And I'm wondering if you see any linkage between the two in terms of, the strategy.
Well, I think we're talking about a huge swath of territory stretching all the way from the Syrian to the Iranian border that is claimed by the Kurds and called disputed in the constitution, and that is therefore disputed. And it involves 6 out of 9 districts of Mosul and some sub-districts as well. all of Kirkuk Governorate, and one district of Salahuddin Governorate, one district of Diyala Governorate, and one district of even a Wasit, I guess, or a sub-district maybe. So in Mosul, in Nineveh, this is a huge issue, obviously. Kirkuk is the biggest one of the lot. It's the whole governorate. It's also where most oil and gas are located, and where the Kurds have expressed the strongest emotional bond historically to that area. But in Nineveh governorate, Mosul, we're talking about also, half the governorate almost, maybe not in territory, but maybe in population. And so, well, outside the city, Mosul itself, which the Kurds don't claim. And this has caused huge tensions and is causing huge tensions right now. But I think the bottom line for the Kurds is that if they get a deal, if they can get a deal where Kirkuk would come to fall within the Kurdistan region, they are probably quite willing to compromise on some of the other districts in Nineveh, which are not majority Kurds, because there are districts where there are quite a few Kurds, but there are also a lot of Christians and Yazidis and Shabak and other minorities, and Turkmens, and Arabs. So they may be willing to give up some of these districts. And what happened last year when the UNAMI, the United Nations, came out with its first preliminary report on districts, there were 2 districts in Nineveh included, Hamdaniya, and what was the other one? Mahmud is actually an Erbil district that was administered by Nineveh, so that would be a 10th one. But so that one was also included. Akri, of course. Akri is totally Kurdish, and so that was an easy one. With Hamdaniya, the UN was suggesting it should essentially, it wasn't being very explicit, being the UN, but it's and also maybe wisely, it suggested that it should stay under Mosul's control, meaning under the central government's control. And the Kurds, of course, shouted a little bit, but that's because there is no overall deal yet. But in the end, that may well be what they will settle for. Akri would obviously become part of Kurdistan, Mahmur, I think, as well, Khanaqin as well. But for other districts, and I don't want to go one by one because we may differ, but there might be quite a bit of room for compromise there. But Kirkuk is the bottom line.
Okay, great. And then for Henri, I'd like to ask you, Henri, what role you see for the U.S. right now in terms of helping the KRG stabilize and develop its economy and democracy, especially in light of the U.S. withdrawal from Iraq.
Well, there's a way in which the United States, I think, took the KRG for granted for a very long time. This was the place in Iraq that not only welcomed American troops, even though there were very few American troops there, but it was also the place where things worked. You didn't have violence, you had a competent government, and so on and so on. So there was an element of, look, this is working fine, we have limited resources, limited troops, we'll focus elsewhere. And I think to some extent that was wrong in two respects. One, I think more effort had to be put in to help issues of governance in northern Iraq. And two, there should have been more of an attempt to, and of course this is not only something that the United States decides, but push for more recognition of the KRG internationally, including the United States opening a consulate in Erbil. Now, for that to happen, Iraq has to open up consulates here. There's a diplomatic game that gets played. Iraq has to demand consulates here so that the United States then demands consulates in Iraq. But, these things were not taken very seriously, and I think especially now with the American troops withdrawing, showing much more of a commitment to the North is important in terms of Kurdish morale. It's important in terms of institutionalizing the federal arrangement. And it's also important sending back that a message that that the United States will not look positively at any attempt at playing with federal arrangements.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, now I'd like to open it up to questions. Ideally, you can ask everybody on the panel, or you can direct it to one person, which is probably the most efficient way. And please identify yourself before. Yes, and there's a mic too.
This is Ümit Enginsoy, Turkish journalist. Kubat, do you have anything to say about the Turkish government's planned Kurdish initiative? Thanks.
I have nothing to say about the Turkish government's planned Kurdish initiative.
Okay. Who'd like to go next? Yes, sir.
Bilal Wahab, PhD student at George Mason University. My question is again on Kirkuk. Hugh Stelterman wrote a report, Oil for Soil, and I heard Kubat have a different version of that, which is very interesting. But where do you see, and I'm asking the panel, I don't want to point out to anyone, but probably both corners of the table, where do you see Kirkuk is heading? First, on the international perspective, we have increased pressure on the Kurds to offer concessions on Kirkuk. Just this morning, we heard the UN Secretary General asking the Kurds to amend the draft constitution, which unilaterally claims Kirkuk. On the other hand, Kirkuk seems to be working as it is. The status quo is actually seems to be stabilizing in a way that is viable. The different constituents are learning to live together. Governance, in a way, is, well, in some terms better than the KRG, because Kirkuk has 24 hours of, electricity that can switch on the air conditioner. Are we going to see the Kurds and the Turkmens and the Arabs inside Kirkuk learning to live together better than Arabs in Baghdad and Kurds in Erbil want them to? Thank you.
Okay. Kubat, could you start?
I think it'd be overly optimistic to say that things in Kirkuk are okay right now. We have seen a continued onslaught in Kirkuk by groups like Al-Qaeda to try to find fault lines within the ambiguity on governance within places like Kirkuk. So I think there is still a strong need to resolve the issue of the disputed territories in general, but in particular to Kirkuk. There has always been intercommunal harmony within these disputed territories, and I think if you read between the lines of what the Kurdistan Regional Government has said, we've never denied the multi-ethnic or the multi-sectarian nature of many of these disputed territories. And even in our draft constitution, it caused a lot of concern and raised a lot of eyebrows. The language was quite carefully worded to say that while we believe that Kirkuk is part of the Kurdistan region, Kirkuk's political identity will only be resolved upon the implementation of Article 140, which was, I think people missed that particular language. People were very quick to have knee-jerk reactions to things that are considered overly aggressive Kurdish policies on things, on matters of justice. So I think that there will be a continued push by the representatives of the Kurds in Baghdad, the representatives of Kurdistan in Baghdad, regardless of which political affiliation or religious affiliation that representation may have, to resolve this issue once and for all. It is one of the issues that cannot be left unresolved. It is one of the issues that is a prerequisite for America's phased and responsible withdrawal from Iraq, because there'll never be stability and safety in Iraq while this issue is left to fester and left to boil tensions all around it. There is a compromise to be made. There is a deal to be had. There is a process underway. The process starts with Article 140. The United Nations Assistance Mission in Iraq is involved. They put out a very long report that has helped discussions along. A task force has been established between the federal government and the regional government. The task force was once again discussed during Prime Minister Maliki's welcomed visit to the Kurdistan region. And that new era of Baghdad-Erbil relations that's really started from Prime Minister Maliki's visit to the Kurdistan region will hopefully help us pave a way to find resolutions to this and other outstanding issues between the federal government and the regional government.
Okay, thank you. And used to be interested. You have to say?
Intercommunal harmony was destroyed by Arabization. The regime policy over decades that victimized the Kurds, but also other minorities like the Turkmens and the Christians, in the disputed territories. After 2003, Kurdish domination in these territories has not improved intercommunal, has certainly not restored intercommunal harmony, and it's an ongoing problem, and it has created, in fact, a good deal of resentment. And this is what makes the situation in Kirkuk today still very difficult. It's the inroads that Al-Qaeda is trying to make. Absolutely. It's also dominance of local government by the Kurdish parties, and especially the fight between the KDP and PUK for advantage in Kirkuk and other disputed territories, which is really coloring everything, and it's not properly understood outside. So these are things. Now, yes, Kirkukis have electricity, and this is a very good thing. They're very happy about that. Otherwise, things are stuck. The place looks like a dump. It feels like a dump. I go there regularly. And Kirkukis themselves experience it as a dump. That's one. Two, in terms of elections, there have been no provincial elections there. People feel that keenly. They want to vote, and they want to elect their political leaders. And it's very doubtful that they will be able to vote in the Iraqi elections, because they're not able to agree on voter rolls. So they may be disenfranchised twice and maybe ongoing. They may also, in the census that is supposed to take place in all of Iraq on October 24th of this year, they may not be able to have a census in Kirkuk, or it may just not work out because of opposition. The Iraqi Turkmen Front has already said it will boycott. Other parties may do the same. And so it's a very unhappy situation. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be resolved. Now, there is a UN process. This is a good thing. It came out with this almost 500-page report on April 22nd of this year. This is a step forward. All the parties have looked at it. It's not yet been made public, but it's out there. It's being read. It provides a very detailed study of these disputed territories. Nothing has ever been written about them like that, and it's very useful. And there is a task force that is meeting in Baghdad. So that's all of that. I think what is very important is that there was an interview with Massoud Barzani very recently in Newsweek. You may have seen it the last couple of days, in which he said, Kirkuk is ours, and Article 140 needs to be implemented. This is the refrain. But it's not like the UN is saying that Article 140 should not be implemented. The UN is agreeing. It says yes. As part of its report, it does not make the recommendation. It offers 4 options for Kirkuk. None of these options include the option of Kirkuk coming within the Kurdistan region. But the UN fully embraces Article 140. What is the trick here? The trick is this. It's all in the interpretation of the term referendum. The Iraqi constitution doesn't define it. The way it's been defined by the KRG is that here, a referendum, what is the question that's going to be asked? The question that's going to be asked, and Massoud Barzani said it in this interview, is who do you want to belong to, the Kurdistan region or Baghdad? That's the question. But it doesn't have to be the question. The Constitution doesn't prescribe that. What the UN is saying is that the referendum should be a confirmatory referendum, not a hostile one, a confirmatory referendum, whereby you negotiate a deal between all the stakeholders in Kirkuk, and then you have people vote yes or no, do you agree to this agreement? And obviously, if it is a consensus-based agreement, everybody's going to vote yes. It's a beautiful thing. First of all, it's allowed by the Constitution. And secondly, it takes away the whole demographic manipulation stuff that is going on, with accusations flying back and forth about pre-2003 manipulation, post-2003 manipulation. It doesn't matter anymore because everybody will vote yes. So this is the issue now. And this process is moving forward. It needs to be given time. And the question is, how much time can a deal be closed before the Americans leave? Does it matter? It certainly cannot be done before the Iraqi elections take place. Will they be held on time? There's all kinds of other questions that come up. But in the meantime, the situation in Kirkuk remains thoroughly unhappy. Oh, and just on the Constitution, I just want to say this. The Kurdish Constitution, I only have an English translation of it, which may not be accurate, but in Article 2:1, it says, Kurdistan region, Iraq, which is what this Constitution is about and for which it lays down all the laws, Kurdistan region, Iraq consists of the Governorate of Duhok in its current administrative borders and the governorates of Kirkuk, Sulaymaniyah, and Erbil, along with the districts, and then it goes into all the other disputed districts. But it includes Kirkuk as part of the Kurdistan region, Iraq. Then it says in number 2 of Article 2, it says, Article 140 of the Federal Constitution shall be relied upon for demarcating the administrative border of the Kurdistan region. So there's some ambivalence there. But the language is quite explicit. Kurdistan region, Iraq consists of Kirkuk, including Kirkuk.
Okay. Do we have some other questions? Yes. Aho.
Thank you. Ahu Özür from CNN Türk and Milliyet. This is for both you, Aliza and Nari. If I can switch the argument back to the Turkish initiative again, the PKK's leader, Öcalan, has set a timetable almost like the 15th of August that he's going to announce a roadmap, a new initiative from the part of the PKK. First of all, what do you expect that will say or do? Is he still able to bring down the PKK militias from the mountains? And where do you put his initiative or his presence in this whole argument about a new movement in northern Iraq, Turkey's new initiative to open up to its Kurds? What is his role in these dynamics?
Well, as you know, Öcalan is in a prison all by himself in a little island in the Marmara Sea and sees his lawyers once a week. And my understanding is that the lawyers are not allowed to take notes, so he tells them things and they try to remember it. And then when they come out, they put everything down on paper. So I've always been curious about it. Does he say all these things, or do the lawyers eventually invent this stuff afterwards? But no matter what the process is, there's no question that Öcalan has an enormous amount of influence with Turkish Kurds. Not all of them, but with a significant, maybe even a majority of them. And so when it comes to whether or not he has the ability to send a message to the fighters, to the fighters whether they should come down from the mountain, yes. But that doesn't mean that the Turkish government is necessarily going to take the Öcalan initiative, if it comes about, seriously. They have to ignore it, by definition, because that would really undermine any effort in Turkey to go ahead with this reform proposal. That doesn't mean that the government will not use it. That doesn't mean the government will not build things on top of it. I suspect the government will have to announce something before August 15th, just to be able to say that it has a plan and it is not being influenced by Öcalan. I mean, in terms of Turkish domestic politics, it has to do that. But that doesn't mean as negotiations go on, as people talk about these things, that what Öcalan says will play a very, very important role. The trick is he going to say it's time for the armed struggle to end? And if he is wishy-washy, I think it will be a major blow to the process. If he says the armed struggle should end, I think then we have a very good prospect for starting to resolve this issue. And I should say starting to resolve it, because this is a process. This is not something that will happen overnight. It will take a lot of work. There is opposition in Turkey, and the opposition is quite vociferous. And even the government, I'm not sure necessarily is completely at ease with this. The one big change that has taken place, and I think this is something that we need to pay attention to, and that is that the current Turkish chief of staff has realized and has come to the conclusion that without some kind of a political deal, this insurgency will never, never, never end. And 25 years after the beginning of the insurgency, there are probably as many people up in the mountains as there were at the beginning.
When I was in Turkey, everybody was talking about the roadmap. Öcalan had a roadmap. The prime minister had a roadmap. The guy who ran the grocery store in Diyarbakir had a roadmap. He used to say, it didn't work that well for the Palestinians. Maybe you need a different name. But I don't know. Turkey may have better roads because, there does seem to be something very serious going on. I was surprised at how strong the PKK was when I was there. I'm always newly surprised at the PKK's ability to rebuild itself despite various setbacks. And Öcalan remains firmly in control as a symbol. He doesn't have day-to-day control anymore, obviously, but if he says, the war must end or we must do X, the Kurds will listen and they will follow. So he certainly has that power even though he's alone in an island prison. He still somehow manages to do that. I think what's important to realize is that while it's certainly important for him to recognize there needs to be an end to the armed struggle, and this is something I think that Ankara really is going to demand, the PKK is highly unlikely to give up its weapons to do more than a temporary ceasefire until it wins something concrete. And in this, the PKK is not alone. Many rebel groups, I mean, almost all rebel groups make similar demands. Giving up their weapons is really the last thing they do. And so I think this hope that Ankara has, or this expectation that the PKK will disarm and then they will begin negotiations, or then they will make not concessions, but will change things for the Kurds on the ground. It won't work that way. And people I met in southeast Turkey also, I was surprised, even Kurds I know who are in opposition to the PKK did not necessarily support the idea of the PKK putting down its weapons before there was real change, for the simple reason that they believe that's why Turkey has moved to the point that it has in terms of opening what seems to be the start of opening negotiations with the Kurds through the Kurdish political party. So do we have any other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, thank you very much for your comments. Yurter Özcan with the Washington Institute. If the Turkish initiative works or brings about a change that we all hope it does, do you think it may be the factor that jumpstarts the Turkish-EU relations once again, which have come to a practical full stop?
It will help, there's no question. I mean, the Kurdish issue is a major impediment to improve the EU relations. I mean, there's no question about it. It is one of the things that the EU uses in its arguments why Turkey is not ready. But again, remember, this is a process. Just like the EU is a process, this will also be a process. So you have to look at it over a long period of time. But to bring back one thing I forgot to say during my presentation is that one of the positive impacts of the Kurdish elections in Iraq on Turkish politics is that for a very, very long time, those who were opposed to any Turkey-KRG deal used to point to the two parties' dominance in northern Iraq by saying, oh, these are two feudal parties, you have Mr. Barzani and Mr. Talabani, they control everything, this is not democracy, they would never talk about the KRG as a valid political entity. What the elections have done is to show that, look, even under, shall we say, feudal conditions, so to say, that the opposition emerges, wins seats, forces the ruling parties to change and become more accountable. So that, in a way, also improves the perception in Turkey of the Kurdish entity, not just as an appendage of two leaders.
Actually, I agree with pretty much on everything Henri said, so I don't have anything to add on this. Yes, sir, back there. Yeah.
Sorry. Go back to a directly elections-related question for a moment. It was mentioned before in several of the responses, the attempt to pass the Constitution for the KRG by referendum. Was the Constitution however, came out late in the campaign process and was seen by some as an attempt to sort of vitalize the domestic political constituents. Do we expect it, does it have its own political force and value that it's going to resurface, or is it something that the KRG is more likely to keep in its pocket that it can use as a token in exchanges with Baghdad and continuing negotiations?
Sorry, could you just identify yourself?
I'm sorry, Monty Frankel with the U.S. government.
I think, again, we thought about this constitutional process as this last-minute throw it into the hat, but in reality, the first time that the region spoke about a constitution was all the way back in 1974. In 92, a draft was actually put together, circulated, and discussed by the first Kurdistan Regional Government. This process went on until a more developed draft was ultimately presented and put forward in 2006. Between 2006 and today, we had circulated this constitution within our constituents. We'd received about 5,000 comments about the constitution, recommending certain changes and amendments. Those amendments were largely incorporated and were presented to the Parliament. I think the Parliament wanted to leave behind a legacy, which is why it wanted to present this constitution before it was, in effect, out of a job. But probably did present it too late in the process, and the Independent High Electoral Commission could not manage a referendum process on this constitution, and hence why it was not part of the electoral process. So I do think the issue will likely come up in the next Parliament. It is not a wild card that we as the government want to somehow use against Baghdad. We need a law that governs, that regulates. We need a constitution that is going to actually govern and regulate our region. It's something that is not a unilateral step. It's actually called for by the federal constitution of Iraq. States that regions and regional governments should have their own constitutions. It has been a work in progress that has gone back several decades, and I think it's something only natural for a region to have, just like in the United States. Your states have their own constitutions, and their constitutions are very, very different from each other. It's something that I think, again, it was taken totally out of context. I think had we, and in fact, when we introduced this in 2006, the same people that criticized us for doing it in 2006 were the same people that criticized us in 2009. And I joked with a foreign diplomat in Erbil while I was there to say that had we have submitted an empty piece of paper with just the title, the Constitution of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, we would have probably still had the same knee-jerk reaction and opposition to that. So it's something very normal. Please don't read too much into it. It's something that our region needs to govern itself, because since '92 up until today, we have only been acting on a series of executive orders and laws that have been left over from the old regime, and that's not the way we want to move forward. We need a constitution, and I think we'll have one, if not in '09, certainly in 2010.
Okay, Yusuf is going to respond to this question as well.
Yeah, well, there have been many drafts of Kurdish constitutions in the past. In fact, it's sometimes hard to keep them apart. But and it's critical that the Kurdistan region have a constitution. So it's very positive. But when I've been visiting Kurdistan for many years now, and until very recently, the refrain was, we will not have a constitution until Kirkuk has been brought into the Kurdistan region, because we need to take that into account. What has happened, why the constitution was pushed through now, I would say two main reasons. One is because Kirkuk was not brought into the Kurdistan region according to Kurdish plans, which was by December 2007 and a referendum. And the frustration that arose from that put added pressure on it, and an attempt to essentially create legal facts. And so this particular article that I quoted earlier is of key importance in that regard. But the second thing that is very important, that is, again, very poorly reported in the media, is that what grabbed the attention of the Kurdish opposition was that this same draft constitution concentrates a lot of power in the hands of the presidency of the Kurdistan region and takes it away from the Kurdish parliament. And the opposition is adamantly opposed to this. And seeing, probably, this is my speculation on my part, seeing that the opposition was going to do fairly well in these elections, the sitting parliament may have wanted to push through this constitution, even though the formal 4-year term of the parliament had already ended. This constitution was passed after the term had ended, and for that very reason, Quran List has submitted a complaint to the Constitutional Court in Baghdad to say that the passing of this constitution by the parliament of the Kurdistan region was illegal. We'll have to see what the Constitutional Court responds, and maybe it will stand as it is. President Barzani has said again recently that this constitution will still be submitted to a referendum later this fall. We'll have to see about this. Clearly, there is a lot of pressure from inside Kurdistan because of the centralization of power in the hands of the Kurdish presidency. But interestingly, also because of the the Kirkuk language, which has brought international outrage, not just from the Baghdad government, but also, President Gül of Turkey spoke to President Obama about it. This became a big issue, and Vice President Biden, when he went to Iraq, he didn't have a chance to see Massoud Barzani because of sandstorms, but later spoke on the phone with him and relayed that message. The Iraqi Electoral Commission, in the meantime, had already ruled that it was totally unrealistic to have this by July 25th, and it was postponed for logistical reasons. But the political pressure was a huge part of that.
Okay. What I'd like to do now, since we're almost out of time, is give the panelists a chance to sort of make any final comments, starting with Henri, then Joost, and ending with the final word with Kubat.
Let me make three points in summary. There's an interesting linkage, I think, between northern Iraq and Baghdad. At the beginning, after 2003, northern Iraq was clearly the light in Iraq, the place that shined the most. But with time, you saw that the Iraqi parliament became a much more feisty, much more dynamic place for politics, and there was a way in which the Kurdish parliament in the north was more like a rubber stamp parliament, did not have the same thing. Now again, the pendulum has shifted to some extent to the north. I mean, the north is now leading in some ways, and so there is this dynamic. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but I mean, there's a way in which both are learning from the other and both are influenced from the other. Kubat kind of corrected me when I said earlier that this was a blessing in disguise, and he said this is actually a blessing. I agree. I mean, it's not. Maybe he's right about Washington always looking for little things, but the truth is, I actually think these elections are a wonderful thing for northern Iraq, and can only improve the situation in northern Iraq. But the other interesting thing about these elections, and I'll finish on this, is that there's a way in which it also shows you that it connects the north. And you heard from Joost how Goran has appealed to the Constitutional Court in Baghdad to get a ruling on the Kurdistan constitution. There's a way in which it shows you that the north is not about to secede, as some people maybe, especially in the Sunni regions, tend to think, or maybe in the region, but that in fact that northern Iraq and Baghdad actually can work together. It's just a question of defining the limits of federalism, or the boundaries of federalism in terms of capabilities, etc. But that in fact the elections in some ways show that the two regions are actually quite linked.
I think the elections in Kurdistan region were a great event, very positive. They're a milestone on the long trajectory. Now already 18 years old, from 1991 onward. And they are, in a way, a verdict of sorts on the governance that the former rebel parties have been able to exert. And I think it's a mixed verdict, and that is important. And that transition, some people talk about, stuck in transition, and I think this is in some way where we are now. We still have the old, leadership, the old Maquis leadership in charge of administering a territory. This is not what they were trained to do. This is not anything they ever did in their lives. And we're waiting for a new generation to come, to be trained properly in Kurdistan, outside Kurdistan, and to take over management of the government. And that is going to take a little bit more time. But we've seen the first signs of it, and that's very healthy. The question is the Goran phenomenon, is it a flash in the pan, or is it sustainable? My sense is it based on the malaise within the POK, which is already looking at a post-Talabani era, or is it reflecting a malaise in governance in Kurdistan and therefore also the KDP? And my sense is it's definitely a malaise in the POK, but it's also a malaise in the KDP. We may not find out exactly, we'll have to see about what the Iraqi Electoral Commission rules in terms of fraud and allegations in the Hook and Erbil. We may not know how many votes Goran took in those areas that were not POK votes. We may not find out. There's not really effective exit polling in Kurdistan, so we may never find out. But we need to look at, in the future, especially in the local elections, what kind of inroads can Goran make in these kinds of areas. That is going to be, I think, determining the future of the Kurdistan region in the next decade.
Thank you. I just do want to reiterate that this is a very defining moment in Kurdish politics. It's a defining moment in the development of democracy in Kurdistan. It's another step in the right direction for us, and we are very proud of the way that the elections were conducted. There obviously, as was noted in the discussions today, there was some things that were regrettable. The one person killed in Erbil was very tragic. But the cause of killing was even more tragic, and it was not an attack on a compound or anything. It was celebratory gunfire that resulted in this, and so that was very tragic. The attacks on the offices of the Islamic Union of Kurdistan and the Islamic Group of Kurdistan were also very regrettable, and I think that the authorities were very, very quick to condemn those actions, and these were the actions of what I kind of subtly referred to in my talks as overexcited enthusiasts and overexcited party loyalists and officials. But by and large, we should not and must not let a few regrettable incidents tarnish what has been, by and large, a very successful election process in the Kurdistan region. We should not also jump to make comments, and Just, I want to refer to your comment here about the hearsay regarding people surrounding Noshiran Mustafa's compound on the night of the elections. I being in Slemania and driving around the city of Slemania, watching the celebrations of all parties involved really unfold, that did not happen. There was an increased security presence on the streets because that night we were expecting the hundreds or the thousands of ballot boxes from all over the province of Sulaymaniyah to come back to a centralized location. So that, I mean, we've got to be mindful that there's going to be there's a period now where people are excited, they're concerned, there's some people that feel aggrieved, there's some people that feel elated, and all things are going to start bubbling, and hearsay is going to be coming around, and we should be a little more careful in what we refer to as fact or as hearsay in an audience like this. But again, I do want to end by saying that this is progress for Kurdistan. I think this will be progress, I think, for the region. I'm hopeful that we can also build upon this progress, capitalize on the very positive and welcome visit by Prime Minister Maliki to the Kurdistan region. And we've got a short window of time between now and the federal elections in Iraq to try to at least hammer out some of the agreements on some of the outstanding issues. And appreciate having the opportunity to speak to you all, and look forward to telling you more about our successes and Iraq's successes in the future.
Great. Well, that pretty much wraps it up. I want to thank all of you for coming, and thank Henri and Carnegie for arranging this and hosting it. And we'll see you again, hopefully before the next elections.